Hey everybody, I'm Mike. I think most of everyone knows me fairly well. I do want to introduce Maggie Hayford from Innova. I'll actually let her speak a little bit about herself and her program and all that and actually introduce herself. But we kind of shifted our presentation around a little bit because I think we felt that there's a pretty good amount of value that Innova can provide from the relying party standpoint. I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview. I'm going to kind of go through that fairly quickly. A lot of it's really just to set the stage for the last slide, which is really around some of the lessons learned and some of the challenges that we've had. Particularly, I'm going to call out the challenges we've had in the production launch that I'm happy to say is actually complete. So hopefully that's a very good thing. No pressure to Maggie and her folks, but I think they're going to start enrolling patients on Monday when she gets back to D.C. It has been a long time coming to get us there. But then we want to get into a little bit about the Innova perspective. I'll let her share with you a little bit about how this came about, some of the interest from Innova, where she sees it fitting into their program, and some of the benefits. We'll talk a little bit briefly about the accomplishments, and then, like I said, I'll get on to some of the challenges and lessons learned. I'm not going to belabor this slide. This is actually who we have part of the pilot. I did want to call this out really because I think this is an important component of our pilot that kind of dovetails with a lot of the other pilots and some of the things that we're wrestling with. And originally, one of the original challenges we had was how can we actually take a social IDP, something like Ken was talking about, and actually give it greater purpose, particularly in the healthcare industry where somebody could use it to access their health information. Because as you can always imagine, if something bad happens, there is no going back from that. People can get your bank information, they can cancel your credit card, you can get a new Social Security number, but once they know about your medical information, that's pretty much game over. So we really wanted to find a way to use these commercial IDPs in a fashion that we could augment it with the necessary attributes and information from an authoritative stance to actually give it that greater purpose. And particularly in the healthcare industry, and we'll get into some of the impacts downstream that this has when you start looking at patient matching and making sure that you're dealing with the patient that's actually known to the healthcare system or known to the provider. We needed to make sure we had a ground level of truth, knowing that we have involvement from the DMVs, knowing that we have involvement from other commercial information providers and attribute providers. We'll talk a little about that, and Maggie will share a little bit of experience about some of the information we learned when we were engaging with some of the staff about the differences of, hey, do I really want DMV to know about me? Do I really want them to be part of this transaction? So it's kind of, added a few little dimensions to our user experience. And then I think more importantly, how do we actually know that it's the real person and how we do the identity proofing? We took a little bit of a novel approach here, with the Innova use case and the patient use case because we were capitalizing on the existing interaction that patient had with the healthcare system when they actually enrolled themselves, because they're providing information such as their driver's license, their insurance information, all their demographics. This is the architecture. I'll just touch very briefly on this because I'm going to circle back to this after we kind of hear a little bit of the Innova perspective. And I'm going to talk about each of the challenges we've had, not only through the pilot, but also in the deployment to production, really around the relying parties, around the new technology that we've introduced into the marketplace, which is the PETP that Microsoft's providing for us. Some of the challenge of the existing identity providers and that market, and some of the things we've had to actually do to actually be able to consume and use those credentials. Some things around the attributes in the center of the bottom about the information, staleness, authoritativeness, where it comes from, and then really about some of the credential service providers and the pieces and parts that we use to actually augment those social credentials, and some of the challenges we've had in actually moving that from pilot to production, and also looking forward into how we're actually going to commercialize this offering and actually leverage these CSPs in a cost-efficient fashion that the relying parties will actually consume. So just to kind of level set a little bit, we're actually doing two primary use cases for Innova. The first one that we just launched is really around patient access to their electronic health information. And this is really around how do we put tools in the hands of the patients and the user community so that they can actually access their health information efficiently and more securely. And then the second use case that we're tackling that's kicking off right after we get this launched, that's been delayed a little bit, is actually to allow providers to actually have access to the Inova network. We were talking this morning about all the Inova folks are carrying around fobs. That's how they actually access the health system, and that works for those that either are employed by our Inova or contracted to Inova or have a direct relationship. But it doesn't address those non-Inova providers, those non-Inova participants that may be entitled to that information that Inova can't actually issue that physical device to, but they do need to have access. And what happens now is it's a totally manual process. So we'll be communicating more on that part of the pilot once we actually get that underway and finish the patient launch. I did want to take a chance to introduce Maggie. I'll let her introduce herself about kind of what she does with Inova and the program. The Inova 360 is our pilot audience in the first launch. This was a very strategic move, not only on our part, but on Inova's part, for several reasons. Really, so we had a very astute population that we could focus on, one that was small enough that was manageable, and then also one that would dovetail itself nicely into the full patient adoption downstream. So, Maggie, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it, and I appreciate you understanding that I am a nurse, not a technician. I have no IT background, and everything I learned in my 54 years has been by playing with the computer back when we had rotary phones. I don't know if anybody here remembers that, but so I'm going to speak from a nursing perspective and from a non-IT perspective, but how excited we were at Inova to be able to participate in this. Being a nurse for over 30 years, and being from New York, I'm probably innately paranoid. So I'm sure you don't know any New Yorkers who are paranoid. I'm sure you don't know any New Yorkers down here in Florida either. So our issue is that I understand the concern people have for accessing something as important as their medical records. So it's not just your medical records. We actually have your social security number. We have a picture of your license. We have all of your demographics. We have your alternate home. A lot of our folks have different homes in different locations. So we pretty much know everything about you. And our patients tend to spend about 5 to 6 hours with us just on their first visit. So there's a whole lot we know about you outside of what you might get from the electronic field. Having that information then put into the electronic record is very telling about who you are. So when we had the opportunity to meet with Mike and Jen and talk about how to protect that information, I jumped on it right away. My mother's 83, the government's out to get her, and that's how she feels. She doesn't want anybody to know anything. And some of our patients are 18 and their entire life is on Facebook. So we have that demographic shift from, I'll tell you anything you want to know, to I'm not telling you anything, here's my driver's license and I'm covering up all the numbers, all you get to see is my picture. And no, you can't scan it. And no, you can't have my social security number. And are you sure you need my home address? So having that shift in thought processes from our patients and in that age demographic, 100% of our patients signed up for access to their medical records, which was amazing to us because we offered it to 100% of our patients and they all agreed. So for us to say to them now, we're going to give you this higher level of security is going to increase their experience. Please know that with healthcare, there's a real shift. When I first started medicine, you got paid for what you did. Then we moved into you got paid for how well you did what you did and whether or not you had a successful outcome. Now we're being paid on the patient experience. So how you experience your health care is how your provider is going to get reimbursed. And that's why you're asked to fill out surveys. And that's why your experience matters to us. Now, my patients, I have two populations. One is a corporate executive health group that their company pays for their annual health exam, and they come in once a year for this 5 to 6 hour experience, we do a very solid health experience for them, give them lots of recommendations, and send them on to their primary care physician to follow up for the rest of the year, and then we see them back a year later. After years of doing this, many of these folks never did the things that we told them, and we realized that we needed to kind of move to the next generation. So we started a physician's practice, but you can't really go from serving folks in a 5-hour experience to serving them in a 10-minute experience, which is what medicine is now. And we decided to open a concierge practice, which means patients pay to be our members. So when you're paying to be a member of a practice, you're expecting a higher level of service. This speaks to that higher level of service. Not only are we going to take great care of you, not only are we going to communicate all your test results back to you, you don't have to hunt them down. Not only are we going to give you access to your records, but now we're going to do so in a more secure fashion. And that authentication for us was really important. And from an IT standpoint, I didn't really connect the dots with how that worked. So for me, I had to look at a visual. I'm very visually educated. So in talking about this today, I was still looking for that connection. How is it that all these parties who are involved in the authentication can't then, because I'm paranoid, get my stuff individually? Who's to say that somebody in the DMV can't jump in and look at all my stuff? And the way it was then presented was, we all know about rope and how there are different strands in rope, and each one of the authenticating parties are one of those strands. And not only are they interwoven, but they're also sealed. So one strand can't see the fact that there's another strand there. So if there's all working together, one individual strand isn't going to work. You need all 5 or 6 strands. So for me, that made perfect sense, that I have authentication going on where the different parties can't individually get all my stuff. So for me, that was easy. That was a no-brainer. So that made me feel better as the paranoid New Yorker. And I'm sure that will make my patients feel better. Because for me, to be able to express that to them then engages them in that higher level of security for something as important as their medical records and all their demographics and their driver's license and everything else that we have and put into their records. Now, I want to let you know that Innova Health System is the largest healthcare organization in Northern Virginia, which is really where the Northern Virginia population resides. So we have very, very tech-savvy government workers. They're more paranoid than New Yorkers. And a lot of individuals who are interested in information, and information now. And so not only do we have this from their computer, they can get their records from their phone. We have an app that allows them to get their records. And because there are more healthcare organizations that have the same EMR system, electronic medical record system, that we do, they can get their records from that hospital. And we can get their records from that hospital. But that authentication has to happen. So having the patient authenticate that and the permission for us to do that is invaluable. So I appreciate the opportunity to tell you from our perspective, we are super excited to roll this out to our patients. And my staff are pretty much along the lines of my patients. Some care, go ahead and get that, and some don't care. I don't care what anybody knows about me. So it's really interesting from a medical perspective how we understand from the IT perspective how difficult it is to manage that system. And we appreciate everything you do, because without you, we wouldn't have an EMR in the first place. So having this deeper level of security, having that IT awareness, and having that authentication for our protection matters. So I appreciate being here to share with you not only our appreciation for what you do, but our excitement for rolling this out to our very, very tech-savvy patients and population. So thank you.
Thank you, Maggie. I think that speaks volumes. I did want to actually kind of briefly touch on some of these, and I'm keeping interest on time to get through this. You know, just really highlighting some of the accomplishments. I mean, it has been a very long road, as many of our friends from the NPO can attest to. It's been an uphill battle sometimes, and sometimes we actually go downhill. But we actually do have a full life cycle ecosystem in place. It goes all the way through all the participants, pretty much soup to nuts. We have a lot of interest in what we're doing, including our relying party pipeline and then our other participants that are coming on board. I think the trust framework is another very important piece. You can imagine all the work that it takes to get all the participants to actually execute legal agreements. I think John and I were kind of talking through this a while ago. I mean, we probably figured there's probably a good $500,000, $750,000 worth of investment just in legal fees of having lawyers from every organization all around the world looking at our contracts and paperwork. The relying party pipeline is important. Interestingly enough, we haven't done any advertising, and we still have people calling saying, when can we start? And of course, our answer is, well, we have to actually meet our first customers' needs and get them launched first. The assurance program we have to actually bring on participants, the reference architecture and the toolkits, and I'll talk a little bit about the toolkits and some of the challenges we've had there, specifically in integrating into the electronic health record, because that's been pretty the long pole in the tent over the last week or so. So let's talk a little bit about from the relying party. I know I've actually talked a little bit about this before, about some of the lessons learned and challenges that we had early on. And this one is actually probably the one that resonates in my brain the most, is the very first time we sat in a meeting with some of the Innova executives and their technical staff and even proposed what we were talking about, where we said, would you ever let somebody to log into Innova to view their health information using their Facebook ID? If you could have seen the looks on the face, and once we walked through from the technical perspective, the techies went, yeah, we got it. We can see how that'll work. We can isolate that. And then it hit the compliance officer. And it was like the wheels came off the bus, and we really had to take some time to walk through it. So selling the business value and the privacy components has been, one of the ongoing things that we've had to do. And it wasn't just the initial conversation. We actually had to go a little bit higher than that. They actually wanted an independent third-party assessment to make sure that we actually weren't in violation. Healthcare systems are a very heavily regulated industry. They're subject to HIPAA. And so that was the first question that they said is your solution HIPAA compliant? Well, we're building new technology, so of course it hadn't gone through HIPAA compliance. So we had a lot of work and effort that was focused on really articulating what we were doing, how we were doing it, not only from the process standpoint and the flows, but also from the technology implementation and how we could crosswalk that to that compliance. That was the first part of it. The other biggest challenge is that a lot of the healthcare systems, are using these electronic health record systems that have been around for several years. There's a lot of patients in there. There's a lot of information, as Maggie kind of alluded to, and they're often very rigid from integrating with. And that's actually been the thing we've been chasing mostly this week, is actually that final leg integration with the electronic health record system to make sure we get the necessary connections in place, because they're in different phases of upgrades from development to test and production. So I think that's a real key component when it comes to relying party adoption, is that it's one thing to say, hey, we have this great solution, we can provide you these identity management services, but then it's another piece to actually get it plumbed in and working with their existing systems in a fashion that's meaningful and cost effective, and also where it's not competing with their priorities. From the PETP perspective, this is new technology. It has been developed over about the last 2.5 years. Working with Microsoft as the provider of that has been a great experience. I mean, they bring a wealth of information, they bring a lot of experience and a lot of resources to bear, but they're also a global company, and they're spread all around the world. So we have folks working from Belgium, from Europe, we have folks on the East Coast, and we have folks on the West Coast. And that actually started to be a little burdensome in the tail end of this, because we were chasing the sun. And being fairly resource constrained in all the technical resources, it often required some people being up as early as 2 a.m. to start on one side and then being up as late as 9 or 10 or 11 p.m. in order to chase the West Coast side of the piece. And it is new technology, and there is new cryptography that's being introduced in this. And I know we have some clarification sessions with several folks to really walk through that, I think next month on that, to really, kind of talk through that. The use of IDPs, this is actually a very interesting lesson that we learned, is that the social IDPs really don't care about what we're doing. They really, don't care. They do their own thing, and they're going to do whatever they want. They have changed some of the ways they do things in the course of our pilot. So we've actually had to adapt and overcome. But I think one of the other key things about the social IDPs is that they really don't care about the privacy components, and they really don't care about the information that they are exposing. And as Ken kind of alluded to, when you start reusing things such as email addresses as that root attribute that people are actually focused on, that becomes very problematic, because not only just from an individual credential standpoint, but when we start looking at integrating with like an electronic health record system and all the information that Innova has, one family may have one email address. Well, that doesn't do you much good if you need to locate a specific patient. So we kind of ran across that when we were starting to do our patient matching, and we started to put in the piece where we were trying to locate that actual individual patient that we were going to identity proof. We really needed more information in order to do that, and email address wasn't enough. And this is actually where the use of some of the information that we get from other sources, being either a DMV or a commercial source, really came into play. But as Maggie alluded to, when we started launching this, people actually had questions for us. They said, whoa, I don't want you using my DMV record. I don't want you using government information. I'd rather you just go pull it off the internet somewhere. The younger population usually was focused on that. But for the most part, some of the older population or the middle-aged generation is really like, yeah, we're okay with it. We can see that. And one thing that it called out in our user experience that we know we have to do a better job of as we launch from pilot to production is we really need to go in and take a look at how we're articulating the privacy controls that's preventing that linkage. We talk about the rope analogy, which is great, and in my brain I'm thinking now we just have to figure out how to do a video of that to explain to folks, because I think that would go a long way to be able to show how we're actually insulating and isolating folks from there. Regulatory, when it comes to the attribute information, as many of you know, I worked for Dave for years, coming from the DMV space. Virginia is very conservative in how it shares information. It triggered a lot of regulatory questions and actually a lot of technical implementations for that. When we first started this a year ago, there was a service that was being provisioned in order to do attribute verification against your driver's license record. Well, sounds pretty simple. It's a match, no match. Everything looked great. And then when we started getting into the actual technical implementation, one of the things that came up was, well, where was the matching actually happening? Now, we're somewhat fortunate because AMVA being in Virginia, their data center being in Ashburn, that we could make the case that it was being done in Virginia, but that would only work for just Virginia. What would happen with other states that have the same regulatory controls that says our data can't traverse state lines and it has to remain in our control? So we actually had to shuffle the deck. Last year, AMVA actually had to help work with us, and we had to actually go completely re-architect the verification service that was there. So there was a lot of effort that was put into that to actually make that sound that met the regulatory controls that were being put on top of it. So we were actually able to revisit the architecture, do the matching at the jurisdiction, and by the fact of doing the matching at the jurisdiction, caused us to change our architecture and our deployment, which is where we had to actually introduce new controls, new routing, and actually new orchestration in our architecture. Credential service providers. It's a very tight marketplace. There's a lot of people out there that have credentials. Not only in the biometric, walk downstairs, there's a whole conference going on around the biometrics, but also a lot of attention and the hype around the use of the devices and the cell phones and what people are carrying around, device-based credentials. So it's an emerging market there. It's a very feature-rich market. And that feature richness and saturation, actually, when it sounds like a good thing, actually becomes very problematic when you're trying to blend it with other technologies and other participants. Because we don't need one large piece in the rope. We need 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 different smaller pieces. You know, using the rope analogy, think about it. A single filament line or single filament rope is not as strong as 5 or 6 or 7 bundled together. That's why braided rope has higher strength. And so what we learned is that the richness of the credential service providers, they bring this entire suite of products, and we only need a fraction of it. So from the technical and the functionality standpoint, that's great. But when we start looking at the pricing aspect of it and how we're bundling it up with the verified information and the root identity provider, it really starts to shake up the cost model. And it really starts to become problematic to get a price that relying parties can actually live with at the end of the day to make it cost efficient. So that's kind of some of the high level, and there's a lot more behind that I'd be glad to share with you all on that. So I'll kind of pause there and stop. Yep. We good? I'll pause there. Thank you, everyone. And thank Maggie.